Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever it is you might be in the world within the global community of Concordia. Welcome to this edition of Concordia Live, and in fact, the last in our summer series of Concordia Live, but I could not think of a better partner organization and a better group of people to have this conversation with. My name is Matthew Swift. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Concordia. And I'm very, very happy to have everyone here for what is a very, very important discussion. Today's Concordia Live will focus on the critical roles of both the private and philanthropic sectors in addressing the global humanitarian crisis. Our panel of experts this morning this afternoon rather, will explore philanthropy with its flexible and risk-tolerant capital, convening power, and strategic expertise, and how it plays a key role in adaptation. Before we get going, as you all know, we always start with this, a few Zoom housekeeping tips for everybody. The audience can use the Q&A feature on SpotMe, which is our digital platform, to ask any question you would like. Towards the end of this session, the moderator is going to choose to ask the participants these questions. We hope to get to as many as we can within the time allotted. We encourage you to engage with both our panelists and your fellow live viewers, and I invite you to introduce yourself. Let us know where you're from and what brought you here today. This webinar is going to be recorded and it is going to be posted online next week, along with a summary of today's discussion. In the interest of time, if we're not able to get to your question, please don't worry. We will get an answer over to you in writing following the event. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator this morning, Maria Moreno. Maria Moreno is the head of private sector engagement and philanthropic operations for USA for the International Organization for Migration, or more commonly known, certainly in the Concordia space, as USA for IOM. And this organization works with private and philanthropic sectors in the United States, along with raising awareness and mobilizing investment that support IOM programs around the world. Maria's work, which I've learned so much about over the last year and a half that we've collaborated, highlights strategic alliances with celebrities, philanthropists, corporations, and foundations to provide responses to different crises and humanitarian emergencies, as well as social innovation programs and socioeconomic integration of migrants and internally displaced persons around the world. I'm incredibly proud and honored to say that USA for IOM is a Concordia Global Patron member. They have driven a number of important issues within the broader and global community of Concordia, and they've always been a fantastic organization to work with. We like organizations that not only talk about partnerships, but live and breathe partnerships, which USA for IOM does on a daily basis. I'm looking forward to viewing today's discussion, and without any further delay, Maria, over to you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for that wonderful introduction. Big thanks to you, to your wonderful team at Concordia for helping us convene this exciting panel. Thanks, of course, to our fellow panelists for accepting our invitation to speak, and a big thanks for all of you, our audience, who are honoring us with your presence, and I'm sure we'll take this dialogue to the next level. I am thrilled to be the co-host and the moderator of today's event, in particular because of, as Matthew mentioned, I am the head of operations of private sector engagement. What does that mean in the big words, right? Like the UN Migration's nonprofit arm connecting the US private sector and philanthropy with all the work that IOM does around the world. I consider that work, the work of connecting the private sector and philanthropy and the charitable spirit of the American people with the opportunities to contribute to humanitarian responses and development, a huge privilege and honor. Cross-sector participation is crucial to achieving sustainable development, lasting stability, and socioeconomic advancement. We at USA for IOM thought that this would be a unique opportunity to hear from industry leaders employing unique approaches to answering a question that is more pressing than ever. What is the role of the private sector and philanthropy in addressing humanitarian crises around the world. With that, I thought, who can we bring to the table that can help us have different perspectives? And I think both the three speakers today represent philanthropy from these three different lenses. But diving into why and why is important to touch on this topic is, as of 2020, 78.5 million people are estimated to be forcibly displaced globally. And this figure has doubled since 2010. So the struggle of the struggling that the Western Hemisphere is going through, the Latin America and the Caribbean region, is just one of the examples. When we have more than 5.6 million refugees and migrants fled from Venezuela, seeking refuge and livelihood opportunities in the surrounding regions across 17 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. On top of that, we have COVID-19 that has further aggravated the already dire living conditions of the refugees and migrants that are seeking refuge and shelter, but also of the receiving communities. And we've seen widespread economic disruption in both sending and receiving societies. Therefore, humanitarian relief is now needed more than ever. Today at IOM and the Migration Policy Institute presented the findings of our report on the status of socioeconomic integration of Venezuelans in Latin America and the Caribbean. Questions like, how do we forge broad and generous migration and integration policies? How do we collect reliable data, generate knowledge, and transform them into actual policies that provide opportunities for migrants to socioeconomic integrate into the society of reception? So the conversation that we will be having today in just a minute is not only about humanitarian context, but it's also about long-term recovery, as we reconfirm the huge resilience of migrants and refugees who have a strong willingness to be the protagonists of their own destiny. The humanitarian sector is at a critical juncture. It must adapt to the changing landscape of crisis. The flexible, innovative, and risk-tolerant capital of philanthropy and the private sector are uniquely positioned to do this, to support humanitarian actors as they work to adapt to this changing context. I am personally really eager to hear what reflections on the evolving role of philanthropy this deluxe panelist will bring to the table. So I don't think that I can make a better introduction than saying that I am excited to have Global Giving, Public Foundation, and HIP represented today. And I would ask each of you, each panelist, to introduce yourself, but also tell us a little bit about the mission of your organization, just so everybody can get a sense of what you are doing for the world. And then we will kick off with some questions we've prepared for you. I'll start with Donna, and then we're gonna go with Stephen and follow with Hilda. You have the floor, Donna.
Great, thank you, Maria, and thanks to the folks at Concordia for hosting today. I'm Donna Callejon. I head up our disaster response at Global Giving. Global Giving is a 20-year-old organization that we're a nonprofit based primarily in Washington, D.C., and we work with nonprofits around the globe, about 5,000 or so nonprofits. We started life as purely a crowdfunding platform and realized quite quickly that this amazing network of nonprofit partners that we were beginning to develop was taking on some of the most challenging humanitarian and natural disaster relief and resilience efforts. And that in fact, donors, particularly in the United States and the UK, where we have also have an office, we're very interested in supporting more local and community-led response. And so we added to our portfolio a very active disaster response program, which I look forward to talking a little bit more about.
Great, and I'm Stephen Keppel, the president of Public Foundation. Public has a mission to engage global change makers and work together to mobilize media, data, and technology for social impact and sustainable change around the world. We're a strong champion and proponent of the Sustainable Development Goals, and have numerous partnerships across the UN system, and really we're a US-based foundation, but really take a global approach to sustainability and social change. And we think a lot about how we can use philanthropy, not just to kind of solve the problems in front of us, but really to think about how do we solve the problems of the future. So really excited to take part in this conversation with you all today.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Concordia. I want to apologize in advance if my connection is a little bit spotty and if there are any communication gaps, but wanted to appreciate everyone who is joining us today. I am Hilda Vega. I'm the Director of Philanthropic Practice with Hispanics and Philanthropy, which we also call HIP. We are a almost 40-year-old philanthropic serving organization, and we serve as a connector, a convener, and an entity that likes to serve as a bridge between all of the different stakeholders on issues that impact and are impacted by Latinos and Latin Americans all across the region. One of our primary functions lately has been serving as an intermediary grant maker, and that work has touched in issues including gender equity, multiracial democracy building, and in particular what we'll be talking about today, the migration and forced displacement program. So very pleased to be able to join everyone to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. And I know that, Hilda, there's a couple of strong storms your way. So thank you for being here with us. And if anything we cannot answer, of course, as Matthew said, we will be able to respond them in writing, by email, or following up. Donna, I know you a little bit more, I would say, than perhaps some of our audience. And I've always been very thrilled of hearing when you talk about this innovative philosophy at Global Giving. Your philosophy towards philanthropy. So I've heard you described it before as a marketplace approach. Could you please explain in more detail what this means and the impact of this approach?
Sure. So our founders, who are former World Bank folks, came at the creation of Global Giving very much from the standpoint of in response to something they had started at the World Bank, which many people are probably familiar with, the development marketplace. And Global Giving, the idea for Global Giving really came because not every organization that was part of the development marketplace won. And so the idea was to essentially create a secondary market for organizations globally that were doing development work. And as I mentioned, responding to humanitarian and natural crises as well. And that mission has really, we haven't wavered from, we are trying to accelerate community-led change. And we do that primarily as a platform that allows individual and institutional donors to support nonprofits around the globe. So very much philosophically around the idea of the wisdom of the crowds and helping to facilitate a more global philanthropic ecosystem. We work very, very closely with companies on their philanthropy programs as well. And part of our goal is to try to influence the way in which philanthropy does approach global giving, global space giving. And our belief is that community-led organizations really know what's needed. They know the best. They aren't necessarily positioned to implement those things alone, right? Which is where great organizations like IOM come in and others. But listening to and honoring local communities, indigenous communities, culturally, cultural practices that maybe the typical philanthropy participant isn't paying attention to. And so from a philosophical standpoint, that's how we come at things. Just from a practical standpoint, how our disaster response work or crisis response work is a little different is for our general marketplace, which would be, the organizations that have active projects on the Global Giving website, which includes USA for IOM. It's really an all-comers kind of exercise. Any nonprofit that passes our due diligence can post projects there. When it comes to major crises, we tend to actively post a general fund and act essentially as an intermediary and a grant maker. We also facilitate grants for many US and UK based companies, global companies. And in that regard, we become quite a large foundation funding some of these crises. So for instance, we, in the last year and a half, have, through our entire platform, mobilized about $45 million for coronavirus relief programs. A portion of that we have directed, a portion of that has just been donors giving individually, and a portion of that we've worked in collaboration with institutional funders to help them identify organizations that they would like to support. So I'll stop there and give somebody else some additional airtime.
Thank you, Don. I will follow up on that because we know that 69% of giving in the United States, of charitable giving, comes from individuals and using platforms like Global Giving. So I will come back to that, but I really want to go and give some time for Stephen to also tell us and bring us to a different perspective, right? We always think about philanthropy as focus on financial support, and maybe, don't get me wrong, resource mobilization is central, crucial, cash is king to supporting humanitarian responses and development. But your work at Public has shown how philanthropy can go beyond just writing a check or, you know what I mean. with your foundation's emphasis on partnerships, could you, Stephen, tell us or bring us a little bit closer to what is it that you see in a full potential of philanthropy?
Yeah, and I guess first I should say, we have to acknowledge, as you did a little bit at the beginning, that we are facing some pretty major challenges, whether it's humanitarian challenges through related to migration, crises related to climate change and those impacts around the world, inequality rising in certain areas around the world, human rights. The challenges seem pretty daunting, but on the flip side, there's more global wealth than ever in history. There's more knowledge, there's more innovation out there. So I think our challenge, our opportunity as people in philanthropy is to kind of push forward the potential of that. And at Public, I think we look at three key areas beyond resource mobilization, which we do a bit of as well, but we focus a lot on awareness, collaboration and innovation, right? So the awareness part is key, especially today with just the ubiquity of social media and digital communications. If you're not communicating your project or your issue, or if you don't have the abilities to do it, it's often not being seen or heard because there's so many things out there. So we think a lot about how can we as a foundation, leverage our relationships and experience with media and communications to partner with others, whether they're small NGOs around the world or whether they're large organizations like the United Nations, to better communicate and get the message out there, utilizing the best, communication strategies and techniques that are evolving every day. So that's one thing. I think the second on collaboration is really around partnerships. How do we, given our unique position in philanthropy, working with people on the ground, working with funders at a higher level, working maybe with governments or private sector, how do we bring those different sectors together to find these solutions? because I think the old ways aren't working, you know. So we look a lot at every project we do has at least three different partners in it. We don't operate alone, and I think you're seeing that more across philanthropy. Large foundations coming together, smaller foundations coming together to organize as groups. And I think that's key for the future, pushing philanthropy forward. And I think finally, innovation, you know, it's really, philanthropy as a sector needs to learn from, you know, the private sector and some of the greatest innovators of the current time period. You know, how do we make sure that we're staying up to date? You know, I think in many ways, the public sector has fallen behind in a lot of this and is grappling with how do you know, evolve. And I think philanthropy has an opportunity to push ahead, and particularly with different, you know, partners in the private sector and different innovators. So that's where I think the potential of philanthropy is. And I think those, you know, we look at those three things as key to driving us ahead in the future.
Thank you, Stephen. And what you just mentioned, right? Because innovation for us at IOM that we've been, you know, for those that don't know, IOM is a projectized organization. We have more than 2,000 active projects in the world, meaning a lot of activity in response to different work. But innovation is crucial. And we've been doing innovation to the extent that has been possible. I actually spoke at a Concordia event last year on this very same topic, thanks to Hannah and her invitation, on, you know, what private philanthropy can do in humanitarian settings is help us innovate in a way that we are allowed to fail and reiterate. Because we need to fail, and we need to know what works and what doesn't work, and we need to go from region to region and see how can we export or import solutions, you know, taking into consideration innovation. So I am very thankful for private philanthropy that has allowed USA for IOM to help IOM in this innovation side of it. And then you were talking about collaboration and different sectors and diversity and new voices, right, are indeed important. So this brings me to a question for Hilda. When I have that in mind, I would like to talk about the value of these diverse perspectives brought by different identities. And Hilda, I know that HEAP also considers itself an affinity group, and convening and providing support for people from the Latinx community who work in philanthropy. Why is it important to increase representation in philanthropy? And is this long-term impact of having diverse voices at the donor decision-making table something that HIP is looking at?
Thanks, Maria. Yes, this is so important and increasingly something that I think more and more folks are talking about. And so for HIP, we see this playing out in two different levels, right? So one of them is representation, certainly for us as an identity-based organization, to find different ways to make sure that there are more Latinos and Latin Americans in decision-making spaces in philanthropy. So serving as trustees, serving as CEOs and presidents, serving as program directors and program officers, and the folks who are really in a position to be able to think about where that money is going and how it can best support community in ways that really represent the needs of those communities. And then on the other side of the conversation for us, and I was just reading this morning an op-ed piece by Mark Malloch Brown and Chris Larson, who was one of the co-founders and co-sponsors of the Larson Lamb Prize, which I apologize, I know it has a full name, but I can't remember it right now. But they were specifically talking about the reality that migrants and refugees are really at the forefront of proposing and leading solutions, especially around humanitarian issue like mass migration, and in particular right now thinking about, for us, Venezuela migration and how that's happening across the region. And they noted that maybe 0.05% of all international aid and funding goes to migrant and refugee-led organizations. And so for us, it's really important, again, like Donna was saying, to center and to support and partner with the folks who are most impacted by what is happening right now. And so within our project called Venezuela's Moving Forward, we seek to the extent that we can to partner with organizations like Venezolanos en Barranquilla, with Articulate Foundation, and with organizations like Women's Link Worldwide, who have Venezuelan staff in places like Colombia and Ecuador, to make sure that we are developing relationships with the folks who are most impacted, who have the most trusted relationships on the ground, and who can then inform our work, which includes not only grant making, but also looking at these other pieces that Stephen was talking about, and thinking about communications and how most impacted people can tell their stories in the media, and also contribute to how we shift narratives around how people understand humanitarian issues, and in particular migration, so that we can continue to properly inform ourselves and the sector, and also contribute to making sure that we're not furthering xenophobia or criminalization of migration.
Cannot agree. Thank you for sharing those insights, Hilda. And it comes to my mind that I needed to have a follow-up from what Donna was mentioning before, but then it's so important about the promotion of diversity and diversity of stakeholders as well. So this will bring me to a different direction, a little bit, a different direction in the same topic. And I would like for Donna and Hilda to expand a little bit on in philanthropy, we see that in the aftermath of a crisis, there's a wave of action, right? Everybody wants to give, everyone wants to be part of it. And it is important that philanthropies are agile enough to respond rapidly to crises when they occur, although relationships pretty much and partnerships occur before that, right? The momentum can be difficult to sustain many times. So first response isn't directed at the root causes that could potentially prevent future crises. So here's my question for you, Hilda and Donna, in your expertise on mobilizing action. How do your organizations strike the balance of, between responding for an immediate humanitarian need in the context of a crisis? Let's say you, Donna, and your examples of we've worked together in Bahamas for disaster response, but also how do you balance that in investing in long-term development community solutions? I would like to both of you to chip in a little bit on that question, because I will have a link for Stephen in a minute.
Sure, I'll make a few comments and then turn it over to Hilda. Wow, there's a lot to unpack from that, Maria, and a lot of different things come to mind. And one comment that's been running through my brain as I've been listening today, and the way you framed things up is you're being quite generous about philanthropy in the description about, sort of it being flexible and patient capital, if you will. And I think, this question sort of gets at the heart of that, right? So, our goal with our partners, our nonprofit partners who are responding and posting their own programs on our site, is of course to help them build capacity and their own sustainability, right? And so oftentimes what we find is they're still fundraising for things long after the cameras are gone, right? And so we try to do as much as we can to support them through campaigns and bringing third-party dollars to bear. So that could be corporate money, it could be a foundation. As it relates to Global Giving's actual funds that I mentioned earlier, we post, our philosophy, to the extent the funding is there and is available, is very much to fund immediate relief, shift into a more rebuilding period, and then to make investments in nonprofits that are more focused on resilience. So whether, as Stephen was saying about climate change and the increase in climate-related, disasters, whether it's mangrove restoration in the Philippines or dolphin tracking in the Bahamas, you mentioned the Bahamas, and marine life quality, or working with local groups, working with migrant farm workers in California after much beyond the initial wildfire to help them be better prepared for this year or next year. And so we have the benefit of being able to direct those donor dollars that way. And as I mentioned, we'll of course then try to influence those who come to us to say, hey, how can we best help, to also support those longer term preparedness efforts as well.
Hilda, if you don't mind me interrupting you for just a brief second, because I want to put here the frame of the question. It comes with a lot of pressure in answering. You were referring, Donna, I took note of your wisdom of the crowd. What happens when the crowd doesn't have wisdom? And what happens when us, that we're working to mobilize the world in action through all of the spheres that we work on? This morning, I'm reading, free publicity here, a book that I'm sure that you have been reading, Philanthropy from Aristotle to Zuckerberg. And we're talking about giving, right? And I was talking about this with a friend of mine, and we were having conversations about the greater good. So of course, this question, Hilda, much more pressure for you now, because I would like to know about that role that you have, like, well, we're mobilizing and having this, emergency response to something. What are we doing in the long term to really educate our givers that much more needs to be done to prevent and to respond more wisely in the future? So same question, but just with a little bit more pressure.
Sure. And the reality is that it is pressure, right, in the space that we operate in. We, if we're centering communities that are most impacted, then yeah, we have an accountability and a responsibility, as well as a role to play in informing the sector, in educating not just what we call the philanthropic sector, but anybody who's interested in global issues or who wants to be more generous. That's really a space that we have to occupy and be incredibly thoughtful about what we're talking about it, how we're talking about it, and to what extent we can be the best spokespeople for that, right? And so, for us, it's a both and situation, and our work is along a couple of tracks, right? So we have our ongoing grant making programs, and like other folks on the call, we invest in organizations that are trusted by community, locally driven, and folks who are really, frankly, addressing root causes, because I think I'm going to guess that most of the organizations that all of us work with and support are of the size and nature where they can't afford to only focus on one issue, right? They have to be thinking about all of these pieces together, about climate, about gender, about identity, about indigeneity, about all of these pieces, right? Because we can't afford to disaggregate all of those and only think about one. So we fund those organizations for the long term because we know that they're also addressing the root causes in their communities. And then when a situation happens like the hurricanes in Central America last year, even thinking back to Hurricane Maria, we are able to very luckily rely on longstanding partners, as well as folks who in that moment become aware through, let's say, some media that we do in partnership with the folks that we fund, to then be able to say that we can respond to those situations in a way that continues to fund the organizations that are already doing the long-term work, and really focus on what they are doing, and also ideally kind of integrate other folks who, like Donna was saying, are the ones who are thinking not just about how do I respond right now, but what does this mean for my work long-term, and how do we keep making sure that this doesn't happen again. So, going back to really root causes, and frankly, just fundamentally, we need to start talking about this more in the framework of equality, of justice, and really thinking about critically, where is the money coming from? Who should it be going to? Who does this really all belong to? So that we're moving more and more into a space where we're thinking about, inclusive economies and more comprehensive and thoughtful development, and moving away from, to be honest, the need for philanthropy, right? Because if we have stronger economies, more prosperity, more inclusion and access, then we are not perpetuating situations where folks are dependent on philanthropy or the, largesse of folks who are increasingly becoming billionaires.
When we were on backstage before entering this conversation, I told Matthew that I know that this is going to go extremely well. My only problem is the time that we have, and and I know because we can follow up so much on what you just said, Hilda, and like what happens when we actually, the aim is to not need philanthropy, right? If we live in an ideal world. But I have one more question that I had for Stephen from that I had prepared for him, and then I have two questions. I see questions coming in the chat. So Stephen, please give us, talking about collaboration or different perspectives or education on philanthropy. I would love to hear from you, because I know that public, and I also want to commend the chairman of your board, Sergio Fernandez de Córdoba, because I've heard from him in the impact of the work that he was able to bring together and actually, you know, fund public. And I want to know a little bit, can you give me an example of this cross-sector collaboration? How do we take different perspectives to the table and sit together, talk about them, and create success, I guess?
Yeah, and I guess to kind of get started, it's part of the answer to the question is the why, right? Which is, you know, we're living in this multi-stakeholder world. Things are changing rapidly. Why are they changing so rapidly? Because we are so connected, more connected than ever before. So we look at that, and, you know, for us, that's how can we create real connections, right, between sectors, between different groups of people, because that's how we believe we're going to solve these problems. It's great to be connected on social media and whatever, but like our focus is like, how do we connect people in a real way and bring the right people together that can solve a problem and solve it quickly, right? We don't, in the past, maybe a big foundation could spend 5 or 10 years learning about an issue and then implementing a 20-year strategy. Right now, we don't have the ability to do that. We've got to find those that know or have expertise in a certain area and match them up with the people that need it, the people that can manage the program, et cetera. A great example of this is a project we announced just 2 weeks ago called the Sdg Data Alliance. And it was announced with our partners, Kellogg Foundation, the tech software company Esri that does geospatial data mapping, and the United Nations, specifically the United Nations Statistical Division and their framework for geospatial mapping. And we announced this during the high-level political forum at the UN. The goal is to create data hubs, you know, communities and actual hubs of data that can help track the SDGs in 20 developing countries around the world, in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia. But which sounds very straightforward. Great, you know, that's needed. But this specifically requires a multi-sectoral approach. You know, you've got to work with government. You've got to work with the local organizations and community groups on the ground. And you also, you know, a lot of the groups that have the data are in the private sector. So how do you bring them together? So that's kind of an on the ground example. But the coalition that came together represents that as well, with Kellogg, you know, bringing their legacy and funding resources to the table, public kind of setting the table with all the partners, managing the program, managing the funds, Esri providing, you know, software technology and resources, and then obviously the UN providing that global reach and the connections in country. Neither one of us could do this project on our own, and maybe would take decades to put together, but all of us coming together, we're able to kind of create this in a pretty short amount of time, with a long-term goal, right? The goal is really by 2030 to use these hubs to meet the SDGs. But I think it's a great example of different groups coming together, putting egos to the side and saying, how can we work together? How can we collaborate for the greater good?
Yeah, I love that, putting egos to the side. Thank you, Stephen, for saying it so clear. Okay, I have questions from in the chat, and I would like to divide them because I see them a lot coming in. So Donna, and you mentioned COVID-19 relief resource mobilization. You did mobilize $40-something million. Can you tell us a little bit so that's one question. I'm just going to go with the questions and then I'll ask you to answer those. So can you tell us what were the challenges, I guess, mobilizing COVID-19 relief funds, relief funds in COVID-19 for different causes. For example, us in migration, right? We were severely affected. Restriction of mobility is the first thing that happened in COVID-19, right? But people need to continue on the move. Migrants need to reunify with their family, need to find jobs, need to find, food for their families. And if I have a restriction, an official restriction from a country, a border restriction, I'm gonna go the other way, right? I'm gonna go and put myself at risk, and my life is gonna be at risk, and protection concerns are gonna happen. So that, from the operational point of view, what we suffered a lot in IOM seeing is how people were putting themselves at risk even more during COVID, and still happening. But in mobilization of resources for causes like this, what was the challenge? And then I would like Hilda well, or Stephen, maybe you can chip in also on what Donna was saying about how this awareness racing towards like SDG, the achievement of the SDG and the development agenda, right? In the context of a pandemic where we are very close to hitting 2030, right? So that is something that maybe you can talk a little bit about COVID-19 and its impact in the consecution of the SDGs. And Hilda, if you can talk about the perspective of human rights and civil society organizations during and after disaster strikes. Those are the questions that I have for you, and I hope that we have 4 minutes, so very briefly. Thank you.
That is a very ambitious agenda for 4 minutes. I will just very briefly say that for us, the challenge is has been the true global nature of this crisis. Normally we're responding to something that is very localized or maybe regional. But in this case, no one really was untouched or has been untouched by the coronavirus. And so I want to give a shout out to my colleague, Sandrina De Cruz, who has a long history in humanitarian work around the world. Who has managed our coronavirus relief fund in a way that has really tried to focus on some of the things that Hilda spoke to around inclusivity, really digging deep to find those organizations that were able to be represented by communities, people from communities that were being essentially ignored or disenfranchised historically, and even more so during this crisis. And so that digging and that adding into our community of nonprofits has been a great privilege and also a lot of work. And it continues to be a challenge to reach those organizations that really, really, really know their communities and are addressing some of these seemingly intractable challenges.
I'll just go really quickly so we still have time for Stephen as well. Totally agree with what Donna is saying. And then for us, in terms of thinking about human rights and how our partners have been making sure to continue to have that conversation with folks and how we've been having that conversation with funders, we're very lucky that we have funders who I think really responded in a magnificent way, especially last year, not only thinking about COVID, but also about racial justice. And so I'm one of those people who likes to see the opportunity in the crisis. And I think these were really fruitful moments for educating folks, and to be able to bring more organizations into those conversations, to have broader conversations about human rights, and also on the practical side, to have very honest conversations about how do we make grant making faster and easier. And so I really hope that we can continue to keep working this way with more flexibility, with more creativity, thinking about different approaches to capital and how we deploy capital, and making sure that we just continue to center what our partners are really doing on the ground, and really continuing to listen to how they define their challenges and using that human rights framework.
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly in these last 60 seconds or so. I think we've seen that in terms of the global agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, COVID set the world back and the developing world back, in some cases decades, you know, in terms of development. So it's a huge crisis, a huge challenge. But like Hilda said, kind of challenges bring opportunities. And I think there's a sense of urgency within philanthropy. I've talked about this, I've written about this. I think philanthropy needs to be more fearless now and take advantage of this moment when we can push forward without much pushback, you know, and keep driving forward. And I see that happening, you know, and I hear that from Donna and Hilda today, and Maria, obviously the work that you're doing. So that, you know, leaves me optimistic and hopeful so that we can really make these challenges into opportunities and meet these global goals in the next 10 years.
Thank you to the three of you. This has been a wonderful conversation. I think that the strategy that Concordia Lives has is the 45 minutes is to be able to have a quick conversation that will just give us that just tip of the iceberg, but have an opportunity to convene again. I've taken notes of all your comments and statements that you've done, and I'm sure that we can share those in an email when we thank our panelists for our attendees for your participation. I cannot thank you enough for sharing your thoughts, for being so transparent, for really sharing what your mission is about in practical terms. I am delighted to be your partner in looking for solutions in the migration world. And I am honored to have been selected to be the moderator and host of this event. And thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Concordia team. You are wonderful. Thank you to the audience for giving us your time when there are so many competing webinars out there, all of them very relevant, but I really, really thank you. And we will make our best to push the messages that have been shared today with our audience. Thank you again, and I look forward to the next conversation. Thank you.